We're going to break things down. I'll tell you, of course, about Sightline security. We're going to talk about why cybersecurity helps you to secure your mission. We're also going to talk a lot about the work that we do at Sightline, but specifically what we're seeing in the nonprofit sector. Because I think, as we'll talk about more in a moment, there's a lot of assumptions about how cybersecurity and information security is happening or what's happening in the nonprofit and mission-based organizations. And we want to sort of dispel those myths and really operate and think around facts. So we'll present some facts today. And then we'll give some tips and resources and a little bit of homework, but not too much. I promise it won't be terrible. So a little bit about me. As Jordan introduced me, I'm Dr. Kelly Masada. I'm thrilled to be here. I hold a PhD in cyber and information security from Purdue University. I'm also the president and executive director of the Open Information Security Foundation. If anyone knows network security or open source technologies, Suricata is IDS or an IPS intrusion detection technology. We're open source. We're surrounded by a community. It's a great organization I'm proud to lead. I am former director of communications of the Tor project. For those of you who may or may not know, Tor is also an open source technology, and it helps people anonymize their identity on the internet. So you can imagine kind of the good and the bad purposes of Tor. And I was very lucky to be director of communications for that organization. But I am so pleased and so honored and so elated to be the founder and CEO of Sightline Security. And I'm excited to tell you how Sightline got to be. So the long and short of the Sightline story is I started my journey in security in a very weird way. I had a personal situation that pretty much drew me out of my existing world, which was marketing and business development, and put me into the world of security by being a victim of cyber stalking. And that event happened over the course of several years. My choice of how I combated that whole situation was I went and got a PhD. Lots of people who have been cyber stalked and cyber harassed pick different paths. I wanted to know how things worked. I wanted to know how could this person do what he was doing to me? How did the technology work? How did the intersection with the law, the technology, the people, the process, the policies, how did that all work? So I went very late in my career, and let me tell you, getting a PhD in later stage of life, let me say I have 15 years between my master's in marketing and my PhD in cybersecurity, was a daunting task, but it was so worth it, because the reason why PhD really stays with me is, yes, wonderful learnings, but it brought me into that place of beginner's mind. So learning something from nothing and learning something when you're in crisis really puts your mind in a different place. And I've held on to that because I think one of the things that we miss a lot of time in the security space is forgetting what it's like to learn this from start. So that's the essence and the passion around Sightline Security. So the way, or the reason why I started Sightline was I proposed my dissertation research to my committee, and I wanted to understand how the organizations that I reached out to for help really struggled with this idea of how can someone be cyber stalked and how did it all happen and how does technology work, that I wanted to see if we could sort of unpack that a little bit and say, how does security in those organizations that were really trying to help me, how come it was so complicated and how come they couldn't see it? So I did what's called a gap analysis, and I decided to look at the cybersecurity readiness of, at that time, domestic violence and human trafficking organizations. And here's a little glimpse of the results of my research back then. And this was 2016, just to kind of give you a time frame on perspective. The first thing that came to my attention was we sent out 500 surveys. And for anyone who's ever done any survey work, It's like nail biting. You just want just as a reasonable sample, but just a few people to respond. We got 222 responses. So the first thing that said to me was like, oh my gosh, these organizations, these nonprofit organizations that are busy, that have resource constraints, all of these things actually took the time to fill out a survey around cybersecurity. Okay, so maybe they're ready to engage. Maybe they're ready to start this journey. The other thing that really came out that struck me about the research results was that of all the 222, 60% said they wanted help, they just didn't know where to go. So this whole experience of doing my dissertation research really set the foundation for Sightline. So we built Sightline pretty much on the heels of my dissertation research and expanded it to nonprofits of all sizes, all missions, in all places around the world. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll give you a much more detailed explanation of exactly how we do our work. But before we get there, let me give you a little bit more around the complexities of sort of this space around nonprofits, because part of my thought process in doing Sightline was really to say, I don't want to just kind of go in and tell organizations what to do. I wanted to understand the nonprofit sector so that we could provide better knowledge, better tools, better guidance to these organizations. So I started to dig out some fun facts, and I love some of these. Some of them are very dated. 2016 were the last numbers that we have of the number of nonprofits in the United States. 1.56. So those are 501c, whatever number. There's 29 different categories of nonprofits. So these are 501c organizations, 1.56 million of them in the United States from 2016. Now think about what's happened in the world since 2016. We have major events. We have the pandemic, we have the Me Too movement, we have Black Lives Matter, and there are nonprofits popping up all over the place. So I would expect that the next time we're able to count the number of nonprofits in the United States, this number is going to jump. So that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind when we're looking at cyber and information security, is that this is a big pool of organizations that are just in our country, never mind worldwide. Nonprofits contribute quite a bit to the US economy. There's been, again, upticks from 2000 to 2016. But the interesting thing here, too, was that 25% of US adults volunteered, contributing to an estimated 8.8 billion hours of volunteer time in nonprofits. So as a security professional, you always try and pick out what are the data points that we have to protect. And in the for-profit space, you don't really think about volunteers. You don't think about time that your volunteers give. And this was a big aha moment for me, because it made me start to think about, how do you look at the security of your volunteers as a part of the ecosystem of a security program in your organization? So those are just some fun facts. And you know, when I started my dissertation sort of discovery process, it was really interesting to see that no company out there was solely focusing on the cybersecurity nonprofit. There are lots of resources out there, but there wasn't anybody really focusing on helping nonprofits do their work better and more securely. And so, unpacking it just a little bit more, I started to think about, what is the vulnerability of nonprofits as it pertains to the rest of the world, right? Or the rest of the companies out there. And I started to think about, you know, what would happen if a nonprofit were no longer trustworthy? So when people say to me, what's the most valuable thing a nonprofit has as far as assets are concerned? And I always say it's trust. Money is absolutely important, of course. Your staff, your board members, your stakeholders, your communities, all that's important. But at the end of the day, nonprofits operate on trust. That is the most important asset. And so if that trust is violated through an attack or through even an incident that is somewhat benign, it's still a recovery process to build back that trust. So it can't be underestimated. What if the sensitive information that many nonprofits hold about their donors, about the people they serve, were compromised? What would that do to the organization? And then who protects nonprofits? Lots of news articles out there are talking about big security breaches in big companies and the impact to, critical infrastructure. Those are all extremely important. But our view at Sightline, and my view personally, is that we can't forget about the nonprofits, because you are actually helping some of the most vulnerable communities out there in the world. We need to help you be more secure. We need to help guide you through this process so that you understand how your organization plays a vital role of feeding people, keeping people housed, educating people, providing emergency service, a whole host of services that we rely on as a society. So diving into this just a little bit more, and I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit because I have so much to cover with all of you. We did find, of course, in the research and continuing on at Sightline, and this is part of our work too, is that we're trying to capture some key insights as we do our work so that we can tell a story about the nonprofit sector better. And we can understand the problem of cybersecurity and nonprofits better. And that way we can inform not only the sector, but we can also inform the security space on how to intersect with nonprofit organizations. But the three key points is that there's no doubt that nonprofits are vulnerable, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We also know through facts that many commercial solutions are not designed for nonprofits, or even the marketing of how to get access to them don't speak nonprofit language, so it's very difficult for nonprofits to step into conversations with commercial solutions and your targets. People often say, do I have to be worried about a cyber attack or a cyber incident? And the sad answer is yes. We all have to be ready, either on a personal side or on an organizational side, for when something is going to happen. Now, the degree of something happening will vary, of course, and how it will happen and the recovery of it will always vary. But the question, if it will happen, absolutely. So we have to get ready. And what also makes all this really complicated, that I lived firsthand, is that cybersecurity and all the language we use in our field is super complicated. If I had a dime for every time I had to Google search a term during my PhD, I think I would probably have a nice little nest egg for a vacation, because it's incredible when we just sort of think about these terms that are being used and how do we unpack them. A great example is in my dissertation research. One of the first conversations I had with a bunch of security professionals and a bunch of nonprofits, we did a little pilot of the survey, was the nonprofit said, well, in question 3, I see that you're asking for an inventory. What do you mean by inventory? And the security folks were like, make a list, take an inventory. So common words that we talk about in security all the time seem like, oh, okay, well, any organization can do those. But what we found at Sightline is that when you wrap sort of this essence of information security or cybersecurity around even common words, people automatically sort of shut down, and they're just like, that's geek speak, that's complicated, that's cybersecurity fairy dust, and I don't know what they're talking about, so I'm not going to listen. So part of the passion and part of the work that we do very well at Sightline, and we're very passionate about, is how do we use everyday language to communicate cybersecurity best practices and principles in a way that organizations of all sizes, of all missions, can embrace and understand. Just like when I was in PhD and trying to figure out, what am I doing as an MBA in marketing? What am I doing in this PhD program that is so technical and so complex? And so I'm very, very passionate about making sure that the language we use is done well and helps organizations progress.